Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready, because today we're diving into a really unsettling part of history, how dictators use something totally unexpected to grab absolute power.
The law itself.
You got it. We're talking legal revolutions and focusing on two infamous names, Hitler and Castro.
Right, because we might think we know their stories, but the details, how they twisted entire legal systems to control their countries, it's both fascinating and terrifying.
Exactly. It's like this chilling reminder that even in societies built on law, those laws can be manipulated, especially during times of instability or unrest.
And that's what we're going to unpack today, how Hitler and Castro, each in very different situations, weaponized the law, turning it from a constraint into a tool to reshape their nations.
So first up, 1933 Germany. Hitler's already chancellor, but not yet the dictator he'll become. But surprise, surprise, he has a plan, and it involves his infamous brown shirts.
The SA, the Sturmabteilung, they were brutal. Their intimidation tactics were infamous. But this period in Germany, the Weimar Republic, it was already a mess. Economic instability, deep political divisions.
A tinderbox waiting for a spark.
Exactly. And the SA thrived in that chaos. But their role went beyond just street violence. This is where the legal revolution begins.
So it wasn't just about the terror they inflicted. Hitler had a legal strategy going on as well.
Absolutely. The violence created by the SA fostered a climate of fear, and Hitler expertly used this fear to justify extreme measures, pushing through legal decrees that chipped away at civil liberties. A chilling example is the Reichstag Fire.
Okay, the Reichstag Fire. I know this was big, but refresh my memory on the details.
February 1933. Picture it. The Reichstag building, the German parliament, engulfed in flames.
Talk about symbolic.
Right? And a young Dutch communist is arrested at the scene. Whether he did it or it was the Nazis themselves, that debate's still going on. But either way, this fire was a gift to Hitler. He instantly uses it to justify the decree for the protection of people and state.
Which sounds like something straight out of Orwell, protecting the people by taking away their rights.
That's exactly what it was. This decree let Hitler bypass the Constitution and enact laws without parliamentary approval. Basic rights gone, freedom of speech, press, assembly suspended overnight.
And of course, the Nazis' first targets were
The communists. Thousands arrested, imprisoned without trial. It was a way to silence one of the Nazi Party's main political rivals.
So how did ordinary Germans react to this? Was everyone swept up in this fear?
Germany at the time was deeply divided. Many were terrified of the perceived communist threat, and they supported these measures, seeing them as the only way to restore order.
They thought Hitler was the solution, not the problem.
Exactly. But of course others, especially those targeted by the decree, saw it for what it was, a blatant power grab. But with the opposition silenced and the press muzzled, speaking out became incredibly dangerous.
So Hitler uses this crisis, this atmosphere of fear, to consolidate his power. But some historians say this wasn't just opportunism, it was his plan all along.
Right, and this is where the historical debate gets interesting. We have the structuralists. They believe Hitler was simply exploiting weaknesses in the Weimar Constitution itself, that the document made it easy for a charismatic leader to dismantle democracy during a crisis.
Interesting. So it was almost like a design flaw waiting to be exploited.
That's the argument. But then you have the intentionalists. They put more emphasis on Hitler's own ambition, his political skill. They say he deliberately engineered these crises, like the Reichstag fire, to justify his power grab.
Wow. So they see the decrees, the legal maneuvers, not as reactions, but as planned steps in a scheme he had all along.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating question. Was the Weimar Republic doomed from the start, or was it Hitler's ruthlessness that brought it down?
Both chilling scenarios, honestly. It's really incredible when you think about it, how these show trials, regardless of whether they were about actual justice or just a power grab, they were so effective at shaping how people saw things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about controlling the narrative, right? And Castro, he was a master of that. He understood the power of spectacle, of not just telling the story, but embodying it. But Castro wasn't just about symbolism. He knew he had to deliver real change if he wanted to solidify his revolution, especially for the rural poor. They were a huge part of the population.
Which brings us to the Agrarian Reform Law. You've got these big estates being broken up, the land redistributed to the peasants. It sounds like a classic populist move, but how effective was it really?
Well, the Agrarian Reform Law was definitely a turning point for Castro's revolution. The aim was to dismantle those old power structures tied to Batista, right? Appease the rural population and make his new regime seem more legitimate. But it wasn't as simple as just handing out land. The government took control of these massive estates, often breaking them up into state-run cooperatives.
So more government control, not less.
Right. And this move, while it was popular with a lot of the peasants, it had some pretty big consequences, both good and bad for the Cuban economy, and even for how society functioned.
A mixed bag, then. What were some of those unintended consequences of this whole land redistribution?
Well, on the one hand, it definitely worked in terms of breaking the power of the wealthy landowners, many of whom were connected to Batista.
Yeah.
But it also led to a big drop in agricultural production.
How so?
A lot of these new cooperatives, they just didn't have the resources, the know-how, or the infrastructure to manage such large estates effectively.
They weren't prepared for it.
Exactly. And that ultimately meant Cuba had to rely more and more on food imports and rationing, which ended up being a trend that lasted for decades.
It's a powerful reminder that even with good intentions, revolutions can have unforeseen and long-lasting consequences. But Castro's not done yet, right? He sets his sights on something even bigger, nationalizing entire industries.
That's right. 1960, Castro makes this really dramatic move, nationalizing all the foreign-owned companies operating in Cuba, with American businesses being the primary target. This sent shockwaves through the international community and solidified Castro's image as, like, this defiant symbol of anti-imperialism, especially in the eyes of a lot of Latin American countries.
And it was a huge turning point in U.S.-Cuban relations, really marking the beginning of that decades-long embargo. But beyond the global fallout, what impact did nationalization have inside Cuba itself?
Well, again, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Castro gets to claim he's liberating Cuba from foreign exploitation, a narrative that really resonated with people, especially after decades of U.S. economic dominance. On the other hand, the sudden loss of foreign investment and expertise created chaos in the economy.
So another case of a policy fueled by a mix of idealism and pragmatism with some really complex and often unpredictable results.
Definitely. And this is another one of those areas where historians are still debating Castro's true motivations. Some argue that he was completely driven by those socialist ideals, that he truly believed nationalization was the only way to achieve economic independence and social justice. Others see it as more of a strategic power play, a way to eliminate potential rivals in the private sector and gain total control over the Cuban economy. The debate's far from over.
It's incredible how these events from history still generate so much debate. It shows how complex and nuanced these issues were and continue to be. It also makes you think about how we can learn from these situations, even today.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that these legal revolutions we've been talking about, they often rely on manipulating the narrative, controlling the story people believe. Both Hitler and Castro were masters of propaganda. They understood that shaping public perception was just as important as controlling the courts or the government.
It's like they knew that public opinion is a battlefield in itself.
Exactly. And they were really good at manipulating that battlefield to get what they wanted. Hitler used that Reichstag fire to make people terrified of communists, to create this climate of fear that let him get away with increasingly authoritarian measures. Castro used the show trials of Batista's people to make himself look like the champion of revolutionary justice, solidifying his grip on power while seeming to carry out the will of the people.
So it's not just about taking advantage of loopholes in the law. It's also about taking advantage of people's fears, their anxieties, their hopes.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because those tactics, they aren't limited to dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. Democracies are susceptible to this kind of manipulation too.
That's a chilling thought. We've seen throughout history how fear and uncertainty can be really powerful motivators, pushing people towards solutions they might otherwise reject in a heartbeat.
Right. Crises, whether real or manufactured, they create this sense of urgency, this willingness to compromise even on your principles, all in the name of security or stability. And that's when those checks and balances, those individual rights that form the very foundation of a democracy, they can start to look like obstacles.
Roadblocks in the way of quick and decisive action.
Yes, it's a very slippery slope.
So how do we guard against that? As individuals, how do we stop those small compromises from building up into something much more dangerous, something that could erode the foundations of a democracy?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? And it's a question we all need to be asking ourselves all the time. I think a big part of it is being able to recognize the patterns, to understand the tactics that have been used successfully in the past. And that's why we study history, right? It's not just to learn about what's already happened, but to equip ourselves for what's happening right now and what might happen in the future.
It's true. It's like that saying, those who can't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
And those who do remember it, well, it can give you a chilling sense of déjà vu. Because when you look at those tactics that Hitler used, that Castro used, you see echoes of them all over the world, even today.
Exactly.
The way judicial independence is being chipped away in some places, the demonization of a free press, we see that happening. And then there's the rise of nationalist rhetoric, the kind that scapegoats minorities. These are all warning signs. They're red flags we can't afford to ignore.
Right. It's a reminder that democracy isn't a spectator sport, is it? It demands vigilance, participation. We have to be active, and we have to be willing to stand up for those basic rights, even maybe especially when they're being challenged in the name of security or progress.
Exactly. We have to be so wary of anyone who claims they have all the answers, who promises these simple solutions to these incredibly complex problems, those who benefit from creating division and fear. And the other thing is silence. It's not neutral. Silence is consent.
So what can we do? How do we push back against this? As individuals, how do we fight these trends, these echoes of history that seem to be getting louder?
Well, knowledge is powerful.
Yeah.
Understanding the tactics, recognizing those patterns of manipulation, that's the first step. And then we have to be willing to speak up. Challenge those in power, hold them accountable.
Be informed citizens, engage in discussions that are actually productive and meaningful, and support those institutions that uphold democratic values.
That's it. And remember, democracy, it's not a destination. It's a process. It's ongoing. It requires this constant vigilance, always questioning, always debating, always holding ourselves and our leaders to a higher standard. And yeah, it's messy, it's challenging, but it's the best system we have for creating a society that's truly just and equitable.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think on that note, it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of legal revolutions. Unsettling stuff, but so important to understand.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from that fire in the Reichstag to the streets of Havana. We explored how dictators use the law to solidify their power and how those historical lessons are still relevant today.
Yeah, it's been a sobering conversation, but so crucial to have. Just remember, history might not repeat itself word for word, but it often rhymes. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
You got it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.